What's up, warriors, and welcome to my Turian carapace tutorial. First, trace out the base out of the lycra of your choice. I'm using a pattern I already made for a Harley Quinn hood and just filling in the open face so that the material will cover the face, which is what you want. Cut out both halves. This is pretty universal head size considering how stretchy the material is, so I'll have a pattern for this and for the carapace pieces available in my shop if you'd like to use these specific ones in your creation. Sew the pieces together using a small zigzag stitch or knit setting on your machine, stretching the material as you go, and sew all around, leaving about 3 inches unsewn at the base of the neck in the back. When it's all sewn up, slip the hood onto the head and with a piece of chalk trace out where the eyes are. We'll reshape these holes later, but for now we just need a reference as to where the eyes are as we build the mask. I've already made paper patterns for the carapace matching my own face, and they'll be available in my shop, but if you want a highly customized fit, you might want to consider making your own paper patterns on your own head cast. And just a tip, I cut and retraced and redrafted these patterns many times to get them to fit right, so don't be discouraged if you try them on your own and they don't quite work the first time. I'll be doing quite a few adjustments throughout this tutorial, and you might too. It's all part of the process. Once it's all traced, start cutting. With all your foam pieces cut, I suggest laying them out just to get an idea of what's going on and understand how it all goes together. And with your chalk, start drawing out the details in the carapace in order to carve in texture afterwards. For this, I suggest looking at reference photos. See where the bone looks like it has patterns or textures and draw them out the way you want. Each Turian is similar, but for the most part, lines should accentuate the shape of the mask and flow in the same direction as the pieces. And as you can see, I'm constantly looking at pictures of different Turians at different angles to find the lines I need. Once everything is drawn out, lay it all together and see how it all fits. Next, get your rotary tool out. These kits come with a lot of different heads, and you might feel more comfortable using something different from what I'm using, but I'm using a 3/8 of an inch grit sanding band, which works fast and can get a lot of detail if you're precise. Make sure you're doing this part outside, and if you so choose, you can wear a dust mask because you're going to be making a mess. Also, these tools can shave off skin and nails if you're not careful. I'm being dumb and actually shaved down 3 nails doing this, so if you're not comfortable with that thought, I suggest wearing leather work gloves. Once your edges are rounded, you're going to carve around those lines, and contrary to what you might think to do at first, you're actually going to shave outside the lines and sand down the space around them, making the lines you traced raised and the rest of the piece sanded and rough. And for a comparison, here's a little side-by-side for the before and after. Once everything is carved to your liking, get out your heat gun. If you've never used one of these before, be aware that they are hot. They look like blow dryers, but they reach a heat high enough to melt plastic. Again, I'm not wearing gloves, but if you haven't used a heat gun before, you might be more comfortable wearing those trusty work gloves because you will be handling hot foam and getting your hands close to that scary red heat on the gun. Lightly heat each piece of foam. You'll find that this allows you to shape your foam, and it will also seal the edges in any rough areas made during sanding. I'm lightly curving most of the pieces, just giving them a little shape before we move on to assembling the mask. You can also use your head cast to heat and press the foam to the specific shape on the face, but that's not entirely necessary right now. Once that's done, it's time to move on to sealing the foam. I'm using Plastidip. You can get this stuff from about $5 to $10 depending on where you shop. What Plastidip does is seal the foam, making it more durable and allowing the surface to accept paint with much more ease. I would suggest 2 to 3 even layers, letting the spray dry between each layer. You don't have to be doing the backside, and actually I would suggest leaving it bare to make it easier to glue later. And you'll see here that I'm spraying these little scale-like pieces. Well, I totally forgot that those little things go on the back of the head, so I improvised and cut about 5 of them to apply to the back of the head later. I didn't use patterns for this, I just cut them, and if they're slightly imperfect it doesn't matter too much because, again, everything about this is supposed to look organic. Now onto those subtle ridges on the top of the Turian head. This is optional, but if you want to tackle it, here's how I did it. Take off the fabric hood and turn it inside out, placing it back on the head. Trim the inside seam so it's nice and small and cut out 5 foam strips, tapering the ends on each one sort of like a willow leaf. Shave down the angular edges like before and lay those pieces down along the scalp with hot glue. This part is kind of weird because you want to make sure you're gluing the fabric over the shaved edges of the foam, so you have to sort of roll the foam. What this does is create a small understructure that will show up once the hood is right side out again. And finally, we're going to start applying the foam to the hood. Apply the foam pieces using hot glue, and again, don't burn yourself. This part will take some finagling. Play with it because this will probably take some adjusting before everything fits perfectly. For the bridge of the nose, I'm using a much thinner piece of foam, and there you see me sticking a little piece of something just beneath the forehead piece. Perfect example of finagling. Turians don't really have a nose like we do, and since mine is somewhat large, this piece of foam underneath will help create a less contoured profile. As I glue in small portions, making sure not to glue an entire piece down till it all fits right. I apply small dabs to hold it in place and will cement everything down once I know everything fits together. Before I mentioned that I prefer hot glue for these kinds of projects, and a lot of costumers and cosplayers will say that it's unreliable. Here's why I like it. It's inexpensive, and if applied right, it can be very sturdy. Anything made with hot glue requires care, and there are rules like don't leave your props in the heat, etc. But believe it or not, I made this, and this completely out of hot glue and in the right places with the right reinforcements. Another reason I'm using hot glue for this is because this mask will be on your face, obviously. I've heard many people swear by E6000, and while that stuff is hardcore, it is not a good glue to be inhaling all day. Since hot glue is easy and non-toxic, that's what I'm using. And there you see me trimming a little on the jaw because I didn't like how narrow the chin was behind the mandibles. It's okay to adjust things to make them the way you want them. The beauty of foam is that it's easy and inexpensive to work with. And rather than get out the rotary tool, I'm simply making small grooves along the nose of the pen. It's foam, it's easy to manipulate. Where your ears would be, Turians have this patch of texture, which I'm creating with hot glue. See how versatile it can be? Now we're going to apply the scale-like things on the back of the head, starting at the top. The top one should be the largest, and they should get slightly smaller as you near the neck. You don't have to do this, but I feel it creates a bit of elegance, especially if you're making a female Turian. And again, I'm just adding texture with the hot glue. This is also optional. You can make these little scale things with foam or something else, or you can speed things up and just dab hot glue all over the place. And onto my favorite part, the paint job. I'm using simple acrylic paint here, nothing fancy. I'm basing the carapace in a dark reddish brown. This is where things really start to come to life. Once you've based the mask in whatever color you want, it's optional to airbrush some extra layers of color, but because not everyone has an airbrush, I'll be showing a few different techniques to get similar depth. Right now, I'm airbrushing a little red highlight on various places. To bring out the texture detail, I suggest doing some sort of paint wash. Right now I'm using a watered down black and applying it pretty much everywhere. What a paint wash does is get watered down paint dripping in crevices and cracks, which will bring out the organic textures. Lightly dab the excess away with a cloth, but gently as to not soak up what's collected in the indents. You can do the same thing with white, though I'm using this more as a highlighting tool. Again, lightly dab the paint away. This is where you can experiment. The more layers of color, the more depth the mask will have. In other words, this is what will make the mask interesting to the eye. Just keep going in, shading the seams, accentuating the shapes, and highlighting contours until you're happy. But remember to always step back. Getting too close to a project can make it muddy. So always look at it as a whole periodically rather than get caught up in one small detail for too long. Now this is where I start really improvising. If you have face paint already planned out, draw it out with chalk. But for me, I have no plan and I'm just going to wing it. And again with the airbrush. Once more, this is optional, but if you do have an airbrush, shading around these grooves can give you greater depth. And since I didn't show it earlier, you might notice that I painted those cheesy scales so that they no longer look like blobs of glue. The final touch is the eyes. For this, I'm using contact cement because what I'm using for the eyes are those little marbles you get at craft stores for fish tanks and vases. They come in many different colors and they looked pretty. So I grabbed them, and since hot glue won't stick to those, for this I'm using a different adhesive. Start out by cutting some circles of thin craft foam big enough to cover the eye holes in your mask. Also cut out a few small, slightly crescent pieces to frame the eye later. Next, paint a layer of contact cement on the outer edge of the marble as well as each of the 4 crescent cutouts. Once they're ready, carefully frame your marble with the crescent pieces, acting as a top and bottom lid. Once your eyes are ready, use the hot glue once more to glue the foam circle into the inside of the mask. And if you didn't notice, I cut away the excess fabric around the eye, leaving the space open for the new eyes. Helpful tip, glue the eyes closer to the nose rather than in the center of the eye socket, otherwise things will look very strange. I learned that the hard way during my first attempt at this. Finally, paint the new foam. Usually this part matches the color of the skin, but because the carapace is such a similar color to the material I chose for the Turian's flesh, I decided to go with black. Now, while some people might just paint a pupil and be done, I darken the outside of the iris to give the eye more depth. This is optional, of course. The last painting step is the cat eye pupils, and an optional highlight, and maybe a stripe thing down the nose because you're unhappy with the face paint. I don't know. And voila, Turian eyes. When it's all done, it'll look something like this. In order to see, I took an X-Acto knife to the foam under the eyes and close to the center near the nose on the previous mask, making 2 holes to see from when wearing this. But even so, you'll probably need a handler. I also poked a little hole in the mouth for a straw if you want to get something to drink, and also cut out the fabric in the nostrils to make it easier to breathe. But other than that, you have a mask. Try it on, have fun!